Tonight and Secure the Continent, our focus will be on Sudan, where the crisis has raged on for more than 2 months, with all mediations and ceasefire proving abortive. We have more details for you in this intro package. Take a listen.
The Sudan conflict is in its 3rd month, and there seems no solution in sight. Despite multiple attempts by continental and international bodies, the conflict has raged on. The battle between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary forces has taken an already disturbed nation into even greater chaos. Many are dead, and millions are fleeing the country for safety. At least 25 million Sudanese people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations are also struggling to cope in the country with aid workers not granted visas. According to the United Nations, more than $3 billion is needed in humanitarian assistance for the war-torn Sudan and its neighboring countries that have granted refuge to fleeing locals. The intricacies to the battle include accusations of ethnic colorations in the fight with the paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces accused of ethnic cleansing. Local sources have also revealed that loyalists of ousted former President Omar Elbashir have compounded the war by lending support to the military. Although the army has denied this, the RSF has insisted that such arrangements have led to more difficulties in negotiations. While issues at the center are the focus, Sudan's muddled political history also makes an end to the war difficult as regions like Darfur ask for a place on the table. The battle for wealth and control is leading Sudan into another grim, sad war. When will peace come? When will Sudan rise from its past of ruins?
This is the million-dollar question we will be attempting to answer on the program tonight. Now, joining me on the show, I have Elbashir Idris, a public affairs analyst. He joins us live from Cardiff in Wales. And I also have Dallia Abdelmoniem, a political commentator and former journalist. He joins from London in England. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Now, I'd like to start with you, Dallia. On the 15th of April 2023, you were in Khartoum. Can you provide an overview of the parties involved in this conflict and if you were expecting the events that happened on the 15th of April 2023?
Well, the RSF were formerly known as the Janjaweed, and they've had a facelift and been given a nice name, the Rapid Support Forces. But basically what's happening is a struggle for power between the Sudanese army and the RSF, which gained power and gained position within the political establishment following the revolution, when they were given a seat at the table for the transitional government under Prime Minister Hamdok. And then following the coup in October of 21, it solidified their role as a major player. And they were legitimized in a way because every single party or actor who had a say or had a part in Sudan's politics made them legitimate, so to speak. And what unfolded on the 15th of April, I mean, when I was in Sudan back then, we knew something was going to happen. We just didn't expect it to happen when it did. We thought maybe it would happen after Ramadan was over, because there was already so much talk of them, because there was the talks for the transitional framework to move into a transitional civilian government, and where both the RSF and the army would be joined. They'd be under one unified force, so to speak. And there was conflict as to the length of time that would take for them to be blended into one. And again, it comes down to power, to generals, to armies, each one, vying to gain more control, more, to give themselves a bigger say in matters. And it came to a head when the war broke out on April 15th. And like in most wars, actually in all wars, the ones who are paying the hefty price are us, the civilians. Those who managed to leave, are suffering, and those who are still inside the country are suffering. And the news that's coming out of Sudan every day, there's no light. There's nothing positive coming out. All we hear is just more, more reports of rape, more reports of killings, of destruction. The infrastructure of the country is literally being destroyed, and there's no sign of it stopping anytime soon. And I think that's the biggest problem, because no one knows what to do. No one seems to know what to do. All diplomatic efforts, all peacemaking efforts have failed. The ceasefires have failed. And I mean, we are right now where we are simply because of abject failure from all parties.
Very sad situation there, Dallia. Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Idris Elbashir in Cardiff into the conversation. Now, Idris, this fight broke out not because of what ordinary Sudanese did, but because of the belligerents. These two generals having a go at each other. And like Dallia said, the civilians are the ones caught in the crosshairs. Now, what's the current situation like in Khartoum and its twin city, where most of the fighting has been taking place, and also the situation with civilians caught in the crossfire?
Well, we are now on our 77th day of conflict in Sudan, and from the start till now, it's only gotten worse, as Dallia said, and as we've observed. So within Khartoum and Durman, the sister city, there's a lot of military bases. Sudan and Khartoum has a history with the army and security. However, a lot of the fighting has moved away from these bases and has entered residential areas. We've seen footage of certain weapons, such as landmines, weapons that are hidden in plain view, used in civilian areas. And unfortunately, there has been damage, not only on both sides of the belligerents, but especially with the civilians, since they don't know and don't understand that they're having such dangerous weaponry within their neighborhoods. Even within Durman, the fighting, the core of it is essentially the RSF trying to take the engineer corps and a strip of Durman that is next to Parliament. I know this because that's my family home. It's right there. I even saw videos of the army essentially controlling that area. However, for the rest of Khartoum, Durman, and other parts in Darfur, the SAF has been pretty pushed back compared to the much more younger childlike soldiers, or rather child soldiers of the RSF that they have been using. The constant attacks that have been happening in terms of the security situation keeps on spreading to the point that it's causing problems in South Kordofan, which borders Abyei, which borders South Sudan. The problem of the stolen vehicles, the civilian vehicles, now being used as transport for the RSF to essentially sneak in. So they're now riding civilian vehicles without having people mark them or target them. The fact that there are mercenaries and militia groups more west of Sudan, so we're talking about Chad or Niger, who have also been reported and seen and videoed and documented fighting in the streets of Khartoum and Sudan. So this is turning into a very, it was already a can of worms before, but now it's turning into something that you trying to pick out every single problem it keeps on multiplying 10 times fold.
Idris, sorry to interrupt you. Does any side, looking at the battle militarily, does any side have a numerical sort of advantage in the last few weeks that this fighting has been ongoing? Or does any side have an advantage?
Well, the insight I can give on that was that 2 days ago, the Sudanese Armed Forces on Eid Day came out with the announcement that it's now looking for conscripts and volunteers. Now, we're not sure whether the nature of this is going to be forced or not, like how it was during the Bashir regime in the 90s. However, it definitely does show a sign that there is struggling in numbers in terms with the SAF within the armed forces. and it's essentially taking civilians who did not want to have anything to do with this fight between these two belligerent forces, and essentially the army that has been bullying the Sudanese people for more than 30 years, now turning back and asking them for their help. So the fact that they've asking normal civilians, able-bodied civilians, to take up arms and defend themselves and essentially defend their country, as they would say, it does give insight in terms of the numbers, and it's a very worrying concern that this could go deeper into a civil war that involves all civilians, and that is something that nobody wants to see.
Thank you, Idris.
Can I add something to Idris?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Said? The RSF is a very wealthy paramilitary. They have access to money that the Sudanese army doesn't. And they're mercenaries, let's put it that way. So they're able to get in soldiers as needed. So there have been various reports of the RSF soldiers being made of different nationalities. They're very swift as a unit. They're not. They have their armor. Their weapons are more advanced. They're lighter. They can move. They can quickly move between residential areas and neighborhoods. And when it comes to the area of Darfur, they know it like the back of their hands. And I think this is one of the disadvantages of the army, because they're relying on their fighter jets and they're relying on their tanks, and these are heavy equipment. And in the face of a rapid, swift, very fluid unit, RSF, I don't think they're coming out. I don't think they're winning that battle.
And also looking at the nature of the battles, it's not your conventional warfare. It's more of a street fight. They're bogged down in street battles, and it's a war that is happening in the middle of the capital. So it will work in the advantage of the RSF, like you said. They're more
and the RSF
rapid.
has been embedded within Khartoum and its neighboring, and it's the twin cities, Bahri and Durman. They've embedded themselves. So if you hit an RSF area, like RSF headquarters, inevitably you're hitting a residential neighborhood. And Khartoum as a city is quite compact. It's quite urban. And unlike most wars which take place in the periphery, this one's taking inside the capital city. So like you said, so it brings a completely different dimension to how the Sudanese army is used to fighting. They're used to fighting in areas like the Nuba Mountains or Darfur, or whatever, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely different new dimension. It's a new dimension for us as Sudanese as well, as in a factor that the war has been brought down to the capital, to the center, when before it was always on the outside. So I think all of these factors have been playing a big part in how this war has panned out, which is why I guess I wouldn't say I understand, but I get why the army has put out that call of all those who can join, fight for your country, because I think it's proven to be a much more difficult battle than they envisioned.
Now, staying with you, Dallia, this crisis or this conflict has been going on. It's in its 77th day, and the international community, the United States and Saudi Arabia and others, have tried to mediate, appeal. There's been statements from the United Nations, African Union, for both sides to lay down their arms and Halab for humanitarian aid to come in. And the breakdown of the much touted Jeddah talks has undoubtedly impacted the dynamics of the conflict. Could you explain, or could you delve deeper into the consequences of this breakdown, and what are the major obstacles preventing successful negotiations? Do you see any potential solutions or alternative approaches to this ceasefires? The moment they announce it, it's broken down in the next few hours. So it seems they're just going to Jeddah for tea.
Basically, the way I'm reading it, the international community has followed the wrong policy, the wrong way since the beginning, since the days of the revolution. Instead of taking a very strong stance and allowing the civic societies, the civilian side, to be a central part of talks, they've been pushed to the sidelines. So they've given these two military sides, front and center. And this policy has failed. It has failed. I think it failed in 2019. It definitely failed in 2021. And its failure is continuing until now, as proven by the USA literally saying we're withdrawing from the talks. But at the same time, they've proven, both the RSF and the army have proven that these talks are failing. So why not take a tougher stance, a tougher position with them, yank the chains, so to speak. There's two ways they could have gone about that. Pushed for parties that have a major say, like to lean on both the RSF and the SAF to really stick to the ceasefire and hit them where it hurts, hit them in their pockets. War is an expensive venture. How are they paying for all of this? So cut the ties, the economic ties that is fueling these wars. But that's not going to happen because there's other parties involved, other actors whose interests do not align with those of the Sudanese people. And so as long as parties to this conflict, outside parties to this conflict, are allowed to get away scot-free with their interference and so on, there will not be an end. And all these talks will be nothing but a gathering of men in suits, talking and playing nice and releasing, very weak statements. I mean, I have yet to read one statement from any party, be it the EU, the African Union, the United Nations, the Troika, whoever, actually coming out with something strong. It's all.
Now, let's Dallia, you talked about civilians. Let's talk about the civilian groups. Why are they not here? On the 15th of April, two generals decided to have a go at each other, and civilians are caught in the crossfire. I remember the resistance and the resilience of Sudanese civilians, protesting on almost a weekly or daily basis even for democracy to return. And all of a sudden, where are the civilian groups and ordinary Sudanese in these talks? And why is it important to hear their voices and have them participate in this peace talks?
It's important to have them because they've been saying the same thing since day one. They've never wavered from their position. That, there was even a very popular chant during the protest, the army to the barracks and the dissolution of the RSF. They've always been saying that, especially the youth-led groups and movements, the resistance groups. But they were pushed aside, and the politicians decided to adopt, the traditional political parties and politicians decided to adopt the compromise, let's compromise. And that will make us move forward. But continuously compromising on civilian demands to appease two generals comes at a heavy cost, at a heavy price, and that's the price we're paying right now. But it's frustrating for me because as a Sudanese, as someone who's living in Sudan, and I moved back to Sudan to be a part of the change in Sudan and to be part of, go back to my country. It's very painful because we want to do our part, but we weren't given the chance. We weren't allowed to be, a party, a guest at the table, so to speak, whether it was the women groups or youth-led initiatives or youth-led, movements. They were pushed aside, and how they can grab back that power and put themselves at the center of it, I don't know, but I do know that the opening needs to be made, and they need to be allowed to step back in and be a part of this discussion. Otherwise, we'll just going around in circles.
Thank you, Dallia. Now, Idris, it seems this conflict was then where it was 77 days ago. The expansion of the conflict beyond Khartoum and Omdurman into regions like Darfur and Kordofan undoubtedly adds into its complexity. What are the implications of this expansion for the overall dynamics of the conflict? How concerning is it that the conflict has expanded beyond Khartoum?
Well, since we have 2.2 million people displaced and hundreds of thousands of those have been internally displaced within the country itself, using having cities like Madani, like Port Sudan, like Gedaref, Abara, these important civilian hubs, essentially, for the conflict to spread, it will just see much more heavy migration into perhaps the border areas, and in areas where it will just increase more displacement or more migration past the borders. Though the fact that can actually be done is has to come into question whether the RSF can even take Khartoum and then from Khartoum believe that they can travel outside of there, reach to the other cities, and actually grab a hold of those and maintain those. Whether they have enough numbers is a different matter. Whether this conflict can even get to the other cities, it's not going to be your typical convoy route. It's going to take a lot more time to get those soldiers in. Why? Because the Sudanese Air Force essentially, well, I said it right there, the Air Force, with the fighter jets. Yes, we've earlier talked about on how the fighter jets are causing much damage to civilian residential areas. However, now when you change that setting into the peripheries, yes, and in the big space, then it changes a lot of things. However, going into the other places, the RSF, it's going to be a bit difficult for them, as well as there's other militia groups who have signed the Juba Peace Agreement in 2019, that they also want to protect their areas, and they don't want to be involved or sucked into this conflict between the army and the main paramilitary, which is essentially RSF. So even if RSF wishes to go into other cities or into other areas, first it's going to have to answer questions on its own logistics. It's going to have to answer questions on whether they can actually wage a war against the other militias, and that may strengthen the ties between the army and the militias to go against the RSF. Whether or not this is actually in the favor of the RSF, if they want to destabilize the regional politics through much more mass migration, I don't think that's
but we've seen a lot of, Idris, we've seen a lot of action in Darfur, conflict between the SAF and the RSF. Why is Darfur important to this two generals, and why does it seem to be another theater for confrontation?
Well, it's only just been 2.5 years since the dissolution of UNAMID, of the United Nations African Union mission in Darfur, which has been kept there as a peacekeeping, stabilizing mission. However, with that mission now gone, and it would be a massive shame on the international community and the African community as well, if this conflict breaks out again, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders have reported that El Geneina in Darfur is quite possibly the worst place on earth because of the atrocities that have happened there, the genocide and the amount of mass killings and the movements of it. But yes, the question is, why are the generals so interested? And I'm sure that's something beyond me. I'm pretty sure it has to do something with resources. However, let's not also forget the ethnic lines that happens there. The Janjaweed, the RSF,
the RSF's origin, yes,
essentially began their mission committing a genocide, killing innocent civilians they didn't consider were Arab enough. And we are definitely seeing that same mission, that same objective of them being done now. Whether this is tribal or politics involved, or a mix of two, I'm definitely quite seeing a lot of that. However, to reduce it down to just a tribalist sense would be a disgrace, to be honest, because I'm sure there's a lot of things going on within that area in Darfur that you can't just reduce the lives of the people who've lost there to some kind of tribal conflict. There's something definitely bigger at play. But yes, the border within Sudan and Chad, where the Darfur area is, that as well, it's raising a few eyebrows of the regional players, of the Chadian president, but also of the French as well. They have a bunch of military bases there, and other Western powers have military bases in Chad, and they're seeing the humanitarian situation and the catastrophe that's causing, and the lack of aid going there as well. So even though the generals are very, very interested in this area, it's now gone beyond them because it's now raising other people's interests,
Okay.
who are stronger than them.
Thank you very much, Idris. It's a fine place to go on a break. When we return, we'll pick up from the humanitarian situation. What are the consequences of this 77 days of conflict in Sudan? Do stay with us. Secure the Continent. We'll be right back after this quick timeout. Welcome back to Secure the Continent and News Central Television, and we've been looking at the conflict in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is in its 77th day. Is there any end in sight to this conflict? And joining me to analyze this, I have Elbashir Idris, a public affairs analyst, joins us live from Cardiff, Wales. I also have with me Dallia Abdelmoniem, a political commentator and a former journalist. Thanks for staying with us. Now, Dallia, I'd like to continue with you the second half. When considering the extent of civilian casualties and displacements caused by this conflict, it's essential to delve deeper into the numbers. Can you provide more insights into the numbers of the scale of the casualties and displacements we've seen in the 77 days? And additionally, what are the major challenges faced in addressing the humanitarian crisis resulting from the conflict? Is aid coming in? Was the speed of the aid coming in? Is it getting to those who need it the most?
Well, the number of displaced, I mean, I think the numbers that have crossed into Chad recently have really increased because of the uptake in fighting in Jenin specifically. I think in regards to Egypt, something like 250,000 have crossed over. Ethiopia, I think I think the numbers so far are between 3 to 4 million have been displaced, whether it's outside the country or internally. We already had a large number of IDPs, internally displaced people, and that number has just multiplied with the current conflict. In regards to humanitarian aid, I think it's slow. It's been held up because a lot of aid convoys have yet to receive permits that allows them to go through. And when they do receive the permits, the convoys are usually looted or held up. And a lot of aid workers are still waiting for their visas to be processed. And it's a logistical nightmare. And it's and a lot of the warehouses that organizations like MSF or the Norwegian Refugee Council or the United Nations they've been looted as well, or they can't access them, and they can't even access the hospitals that are still somewhat functioning within the country. So it's a mess. It's a humanitarian mess, and it's a humanitarian problem because Idris said, the United Nations said 25 million are at a crisis. They're predicting 25 million Sudanese will need humanitarian aid. That's more than half the population. Sudan is only a population of between 42 to 44 million. So that number went up from 19. In December, the report had said 19 million people will need help. That number jumped to 25 million. And with the rainy seasons coming along, and with the ongoing fighting, it's just going to get worse. And also don't forget, like I mentioned earlier, the destruction to the infrastructure. And when I say the infrastructure, I don't mean just roads and bridges. I also mean the factories that actually produce food, that supplied the whole country, flour, the basic necessities like flour and water. There's still reports of power outages in a lot of cities, in a lot of towns. Water, there's a problem with the water stations. So there's nothing positive to say, unfortunately. It's just a every time I read a report, it dawns on me how much worse it's getting every day, every single day. It's getting worse and worse. And a lot of the cities that have taken in, displaced people from Khartoum, they're also suffering under the immense number of people who have come, because these are small towns. They could, so now from a city that would have maybe 2 million civilians, they now have maybe 4 million. How do you address their needs?
There's a pressure on the system. Now, Idris, Dallia just painted a very grim situation. And, when there's fighting, there are also people that are looking at diplomatic channels to stop this fighting, because it can't go on forever. Now, previous ceasefire agreements have had limited success in reducing violence and protecting civilians. What factors do you think hinder the effectiveness of these agreements, and are there any common challenges that arise when attempting to implement and enforce ceasefires? What can we learn from past attempts? Because it's been a stop-start situation. What can we learn from previous attempts to develop a more effective strategies for achieving sustainable peace?
Well, I think we'll have to look into the people of Darfur. There are certain localities that have their own locally signed ceasefires, and it's worked out well for them. And the way they've managed to run it and the mechanisms that they've used is definitely something the international community should study and see, so they can implement it on their side as well. So once again, we're seeing on how the Sudanese people are taking the lead, essentially, in trying to stop this senseless war. The way that it's been going on, I'm sure we've seen during the talks in Jeddah, the very first ceasefire and the agreement that they've signed within Jeddah, it was more of a rules of engagement. And even then, within this rules of engagement, it didn't mention in terms of stopping violence towards civilians. It said in terms of how to limit the use of weaponry within civilian areas. So if we're taking that as our first step towards having an end towards this conflict, then it seems a bit grim that the international community first has to set, and the belligerents themselves, after how many days was it, 50, 40 odd days, that they finally established rules of engagement before going any further. However, there were a few good points in terms of the monitoring mechanisms that they wish to implement, and they've implemented now in this modern day and age, in using open source information and using technology, going up to satellites to see burning fires that are happening in areas that may have very little communication. It's good to see that at least mechanisms in terms of observing are being withheld and strengthened and enforced. However, in terms of keeping the peace, or rather enforcing the peace, there is no strategy in place. And we definitely have seen the behavior of the belligerents wishing to push more towards violence. How do we know this? From the constant act on both sides of refusing to initially sit down with each other during the talks, or even more, when they finally had time to sit down, they would get up and leave, in terms of a problem between the two on the table, rather than keeping them at the table. And that's the most important thing, because as if they leave the table, then there is absolutely no hope if leaving statecraft to warlords. However, keeping them on that table and still pushing for any sort of agreement, or even if it's a simple rules of engagement, which we've seen still they don't follow. It seems the chain of command from high up doesn't reach all the way to the soldiers down at the bottom, but it's still needed. And I'll definitely say to the international community to look at the localized ceasefires, especially in places like Darfur, that has unfortunately been accustomed to violence these past few decades, and see how they've managed to handle it. However, though they will argue that this war is an existential one between the two institutions, it's still, or rather one institution and the other one a militia, it's still a great cause of concern. And it's, if anything, it's worked in other areas. In other parts of Sudan, people are trying to live their day-to-day lives, and even as this continues, it benefits nobody, neither anyone in the army nor does anyone in the RSF. And so they need to have a strategy for long-term thinking and sit down on how they could possibly try to rebuild. But once again, these are questions I hope that they're trying to think of and trying to do.
Thank you, Idris. Now, Dallia, Idris mentioned international mediation. We've seen the United States pull out of the Jeddah talks. How important or what role the Jeddah talks, the United States and Saudi Arabia, how much of a role have they played in this conflict? And we often tout African solutions to African problems. There's a saying that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you can't go to sleep. What is IGAD doing, and also the African Union? Have they provided any attempts to mediate in this conflict? And where do you think this influence can come from to, just get this belligerents to stop the fighting so as not to exacerbate the situation with civilians caught in the crosshairs?
I think they need to lean more forcibly on both sides. I think the nice talk doesn't do much. It hasn't done much at all. They need to come in, be stronger, put more pressure on the parties or the actors that can have an influence on either side. A country, for example, IGAD, I think actually come out and done an interview, and he was quite strong with his, what do you call it, deploration of what's been happening in Darfur. So I think more can be done, but isn't. And if any of the art actors that you mentioned, whether it's IGAD or the African Union or JED, an end to this conflict, they can if they want to. I think tiptoeing around these two generals doesn't really help anyone. And I think also in regards to IGAD or the African Union, they have to be very wary of the spillover effect of this conflict. You don't want it to become into a region. You don't want it to turn into a regional conflict. Africa, we already have enough problems as it is. You don't need to add another new conflict to the agenda, so to speak. So I personally think more can be done, and more can be said, and more can be achieved. But for some reason, which I still don't understand why, they're just taking the hold the stick from the middle approach, which doesn't really help anyone. And they need to really take a stand and need to take a position and say this has to be done, and they bring down pressure on either side. And like I mentioned,
sorry to interrupt you, Dallia. Do you think, because you did mention earlier that some of these external actors do have their own interest in this, and some might be leaning towards one particular group or the other. So would you see a uniform position coming from all the international actors saying, look, we're all on the same page, this fighting needs to end? Or is it something of a fairy tale?
No, absolutely. I think Washington, for example, the UAE has become quite the big player in the past 10 years or so politically. And they play a big part in what's happening in Sudan. So I think pressure can be brought on them to say, you know what, do your part. They've closed all visas to Sudan, so we can't even go to the UAE, for example, as seeking refuge. Yet at the same time, they're not helping matters back home. They're just adding, more oil, more gas to the flames, so to speak. So countries like the UAE, countries like Egypt, they can play a part, but for some odd reason, whether they're being excluded or not enough pressure has been placed on them to have a part, I don't know. But certainly in regards to the UAE, I think more can be done from their side, because they're on good terms with Hemeti. He supplied them with soldiers for the war in Yemen. there've been some reports saying that the weapons the RSF uses has come via the UAE. The RSF has business entities based in the UAE. So there's several ways that they can bring about pressure.
Okay.
Financially is one of them. Cut off their economic ties.
Thank you, Dallia. Now, finally, Idris, as we begin to wrap up this conversation, looking ahead, what are the prospects for peaceful resolution to the conflict in Sudan? Are there any ongoing diplomatic initiatives or peace negotiations that hold promise? And the million-dollar question, what steps need to be taken to de-escalate the violence and work towards sustainable peace in your country?
Well, I'm not sure on me answering $1 million question, but I'll do 500,000 and I'll give the other 500,000 to Dallia. In terms of this one, well, as we said, with the problems of the growing humanitarian situation, it does definitely need to stop now. With the rainy season coming in, it's just going to make logistics impossible. Then with the famine that will come because of the missed agricultural season due to this conflict, it's also something that's going to heavily impact Sudan and the region as well. Sudan is one of the biggest breadbaskets in its region and in the world and in the Arab and African world as well. So in terms of diplomatic talks and initiatives being done, I'm sure it's being done. However, in terms of the willpower and the strength of it, it's very slow. It's not being as effective as enough. It definitely does need that resolution with the civilians as well. Whatever happens going forward, is imperative that security forces on both sides of the equation, or all equations really, is not sitting at the helm of government as we've seen before in the previous decades. And perhaps that may just change the equation going into the future. So it's definitely that the diplomats have to take civilians into account. They can't sidelight them again as they did in 2019, as they did in 2021. They have to give legitimacy to the Sudanese people in any efforts and diplomatic talks, and setting up a framework and a roadmap that will lead to at least a stable country before we can even talk about things like elections, which could happen in a few years' times if this conflict ends swiftly. Though anything done on the international scale, yes, it involves the generals, but it really needs to involve the Sudanese people and the reparations towards them for the amounts and damages that they have received. Now, who's going to lead that? Which bloc of countries is going to lead that? That's still up in the air. However, I'm definitely for Africans dealing with African problems, so we can actually get to a point where we fully understand what's going on, and that it keeps within the norms and cultures that everybody understands. Unfortunately, when you do have foreign intervention coming in, it does have a few strings attached. That's fair enough. However, the countries that do want to do that, they have to respect Sudan's strategic interests as well, and its people's interests as well.
Okay.
And we're now seeing that align together. So in terms of $1 million, no, 500,000.
Okay.
That's my guess. I'll give the rest to Dallia if there's some time.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to my esteemed guest, Elbashir Idris, Public Affairs Analyst, joining from Cardiff in Wales, and also Dallia Abdelmoniem, political commentator and former journalist, joining us from London. I do appreciate your time and insights, and we hope that peace returns to Sudan very soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, to stop the conflict in Sudan, international partners must increase financial pressure on both the RSF and the SAF. Former Bashir-era government officials need to change their political calculations at the negotiation table. Sudan cannot be stable if there are two armies and a former regime elite Islamists are allowed to sow discord. International partners need to put coordinated financial pressure on RSF leaders to commit to integrating rapidly into the army, and on former regime leaders to stop inciting violence. International partners should also put SAF generals on notice that they must honor their pledges to hand over power. Thanks for watching, but remember to stay safe at all times. I am Gbenga Aborowa. See you next time on Secure the Continent. Bye-bye.